The moment Grand Admiral Thrawn became aware that the stars around him no longer followed the cartographic logic of the known galaxy, he understood that survival would depend on restraint rather than dominance. There was no hyperspace wake, no familiar stellar signatures, no imperial transponder echoes hiding in the void. What existed instead was a lattice of distant energy spikes, massive conduits of mass and velocity that curved space not through hyperspace, but through controlled gravitational manipulation. Thrawn did not attempt to move immediately. He ordered silence, passive sensors only, and allowed time itself to become his first tool. A galaxy revealed itself most clearly when it believed it was unobserved. Thrawn studied the mass relays without naming them as such, because naming implied assumption. He measured traffic density, vector consistency, and exit dispersion patterns. Ships emerged and vanished in predictable arcs, suggesting a network designed for efficiency rather than secrecy. This alone told him much about the civilization that built it. Empires obsessed with control favored choke points that could be fortified or denied. This galaxy favored flow. That preference suggested cooperation enforced by convention rather than conquest enforced by fear. Thrawn cataloged that distinction carefully. A system that relied on mutual trust was strong in unity, but brittle under deception. As days passed, fragments of intercepted communication began to resolve into structure. Language clusters overlapped yet remained distinct, implying a multi-species political order. No single voice dominated the spectrum. Instead, authority appeared distributed, mediated, endlessly negotiated. Thrawn noted how often urgency dissolved into committee language, how crises were framed as discussions rather than commands. This was not weakness in isolation, but it was inertia, and inertia could be shaped. The most dangerous enemy was one that adapted quickly. The second most dangerous was one that believed its existing processes were sufficient for all future threats. Thrawn expanded his analysis beyond fleets and politics and into culture. Every intercepted transmission carried unintentional data, emotional cadence, assumptions about safety, the presence or absence of fear. This galaxy feared pirates, border wars, and internal unrest, but it did not fear extinction. That absence was louder than any alarm. Civilizations that had never faced total annihilation tended to misjudge threats that operated beyond familiar scales. Thrawn had seen this before in the complacency of the Old Republic, in the disbelief that preceded the Clone Wars. History did not repeat itself, but it rhymed with brutal consistency. He identified the Citadel not as a capital, but as a symbol engine. Traffic density, diplomatic routing, and information gravity all curved toward a single artificial structure. This was where legitimacy was manufactured. Control of the Citadel would not grant immediate power, but influence over perception. Thrawn did not need to see its architecture to understand its function. It was a stabilizer, designed to make conflict appear manageable and progress inevitable. Such structures created peace, but they also delayed recognition of existential danger. Thrawn did not yet know what that danger was, but he was certain it existed. No galaxy this organized survived without having buried something catastrophic in its past. Rather than revealing himself, Thrawn chose misdirection. He allowed minor sensor anomalies to be detected along trade routes, just enough to spark rumor without clarity. Merchant vessels reported ghost signatures. Patrols found evidence of engagement without wreckage. Each incident was engineered to provoke curiosity without escalation. Thrawn understood that intelligence agencies, when confronted with uncertainty, often competed with one another instead of collaborating. By remaining ambiguous, he encouraged fragmentation. Every faction would begin constructing its own version of the truth, and in doing so, blind itself to the larger pattern. Thrawn's assessment of mass effect technology deepened with every observation. Kinetic barriers fascinated him not because they were impressive, but because they revealed doctrine. Shields designed to deflect mass rather than energy implied a battlefield philosophy centered on attrition and sustained fire. This galaxy expected to absorb damage before delivering decisive blows. It was a philosophy born from prolonged conflict, not rapid annihilation. Thrawn adjusted his internal models accordingly. This was a galaxy prepared for war, but not for surprise. It defended itself well against known enemies, poorly against unknown ones. As his understanding grew, so did his concern. He detected anomalies in long-range data patterns, irregularities in historical records, references to ancient threats dismissed as myth. These were not isolated legends, but recurring absences, entire eras reduced to footnotes. Civilizations erased not by conquest, but by omission. Thrawn had seen the aftermath of such erasures before, cultures that remove trauma from memory to preserve cohesion. The strategy worked until it didn't. Amnesia was a form of vulnerability. Thrawn began to suspect that this galaxy was living between cycles, unaware of the mechanism that defined its history. He did not yet know the name Reaper, but he recognized the architecture of inevitability. Something here called civilizations, not out of malice, but design. That realization shifted his priorities. Conquest became irrelevant. Alignment became optional. Survival, however, required intervention. A strategist did not need loyalty to defend a system from collapse. He needed clarity, leverage, and time. Time, however, was not infinite. Thrawn observed acceleration in certain military programs, unexplained resource mobilizations justified by vague threats. Someone knew more than they admitted. Information asymmetry was already in play. Thrawn marked these actors carefully, not as enemies, but as nodes. Knowledge, even incomplete, was power, and power left traces. He followed those traces quietly, mapping influence rather than authority. By the end of his initial assessment, Thrawn reached a conclusion that would define every action that followed. This galaxy would not be saved by unity, because its unity was performative. It would not be saved by technology, because its technology reinforced predictable behavior. It would not be saved by heroism, because its heroes were trained to react, not to preempt. If annihilation was coming, then prevention would require violating every assumption this civilization held about itself. Thrawn did not announce his arrival. He did not seek allies. He did not issue ultimatums. He simply began planning as if the galaxy were already under siege and had not yet noticed. In doing so, he positioned himself not as a conqueror or a savior, but as something far more dangerous, a variable the cycle had never accounted for. Thrawn's next priority was understanding authority in this galaxy, not as it was declared, but as it actually functioned under pressure. Formal hierarchies were easy to map, but real power revealed itself only when systems were stressed. He therefore engineered stress carefully. Along the periphery of Citadel space, small but precise disruptions began to occur. Shipping lanes experienced near misses that could not be traced to pirates. Colonial sensor arrays registered brief gravitational distortions that defied existing models. Communications relays suffered momentary desynchronization, never long enough to cause panic, but long enough to trigger reports. Each incident was isolated, each explanation plausible, yet collectively they formed a pattern that only a centralized intelligence apparatus could detect. The response was exactly as Thrawn anticipated. Individual species, governments, reacted according to their cultural instincts. The Turians increased patrols and adjusted fleet readiness, interpreting the anomalies as potential hostile probes. The Asari convened committees, seeking consensus before action, their confidence in diplomacy delaying decisive measures. The Solarians fragmented the problem into research silos, each racing to outpace the others in analysis, unintentionally duplicating effort. Humans, newer to galactic leadership and eager to prove relevance, attempted to investigate everything at once, stretching their intelligence resources thin. No unified doctrine emerged. Every response made sense locally, and that was the flaw. Thrawn observed not from a single vantage point, but through inference. He never intercepted primary command channels directly. Instead, he studied the echoes, supply requisitions, changes in patrol rotations, diplomatic traffic spikes following closed-door meetings. These secondary indicators told him more than any classified briefing could have. A civilization's blind spots were always visible in what it failed to protect. In this case, information coherence was unguarded. Everyone collected data, but no one truly synthesized it. What intrigued Thrawn most was the Spectre program. Here was an institution that operated outside conventional accountability, granted authority to act unilaterally in the name of galactic stability. At first glance, it resembled the Imperial intelligence structures he had worked alongside, yet the philosophical foundation was different. Spectres were trusted to improvise based on personal judgment rather than strategic doctrine. They were tools of adaptability, not instruments of long-term design. Such agents were effective against evolving threats, but unreliable against architects. Thrawn did not fear specters. He feared the system that relied on them as a substitute for planning. Rather than avoiding specter attention, Thrawn subtly attracted it. He allowed fragments of false intelligence to surface in black market networks, hints of an unknown faction operating beyond relay space. The data was compelling enough to warrant investigation, yet incomplete enough to mislead. Spectres began pursuing shadows, chasing individual leads that pointed in different directions. Each agent believed they were uncovering a unique thread, unaware that all threads led nowhere. Thrawn was not wasting their time. He was calibrating their response patterns, learning how quickly they escalated, how independently they acted, and how much collateral ambiguity they tolerated. As this unfolded, Thrawn turned his attention to the military-industrial core of the galaxy. He noted how heavily Mass Effect civilizations relied on standardized ship classes and shared design philosophies. Interoperability was prized, allowing mixed-species fleets to operate efficiently. This was a strength in coalition warfare, but it also meant predictability at scale. Thrawn analyzed engagement simulations based on publicly available doctrine and quietly introduced variables that these simulations never accounted for: asymmetric command delays, cultural hesitation thresholds, and morale collapse under unfamiliar tactics. The results were consistent. Against known threats, the galaxy performed admirably. Against an enemy that refused to behave as expected, losses escalated exponentially. He began to suspect that the true vulnerability of this galaxy was not technological or political, but psychological. Its civilizations believed in progress as a linear concept. Each crisis was assumed to be worse than the last, but also more solvable. There was faith that tomorrow would be safer than today, provided the correct procedures were followed. Thrawn recognized this mindset from historical records of the Old Republic. Such faith encouraged bravery, but it also discouraged imagination. Catastrophic scenarios were dismissed as implausible until they were unavoidable. Evidence of cyclical extinction continued to surface in fragments. Ancient ruins on dead worlds. Prothean artifacts stripped of context. Databases with suspiciously curated historical timelines. Thrawn did not need full confirmation to act. In strategy, absolute certainty was a luxury rarely afforded. He operated instead on probability gradients. If the likelihood of a galaxy-wide extermination event exceeded a certain threshold, then preparation became mandatory, regardless of political acceptance. The challenge was not identifying the threat, but convincing a complacent system to acknowledge it without inducing paralysis. Thrawn considered revealing himself. A sudden appearance of an unknown fleet with unfamiliar technology would force immediate attention. But attention was not the same as trust, and trust was essential. An external warning, no matter how accurate, would be filtered through fear and suspicion. He would be framed as either invader or manipulator. Both interpretations would lead to resistance. Thrawn required influence without visibility, control without ownership. He needed to shape decisions while allowing others to believe those decisions were their own. To that end, he began subtly reinforcing certain narratives already present within the galaxy. Research grants were redirected through shell intermediaries toward studies of ancient machine intelligences. Fringe scientists found unexpected funding. Military analysts skeptical of official threat assessments gained platforms to publish dissenting models. None of these voices referenced Thrawn or his actions. They simply amplified doubts that already existed. Over time, skepticism gained legitimacy. Conversations that once occurred in private moved into policy discussions. The idea that the galaxy faced an unprecedented existential threat slowly transitioned from paranoia to contingency. The Reapers, though still unnamed by Thrawn, occupied an increasing portion of his strategic simulations. He modeled them not as villains, but as systems. Systems followed logic, and logic could be disrupted. He theorized that their reliance on predictable harvest cycles created a form of strategic rigidity. They expected resistance, but only within certain parameters. They expected unity to fail and desperation to fragment civilizations. What they might not expect was an external strategist capable of operating outside the cycle entirely. Thrawn identified one crucial difference between this galaxy and his own. The Force did not permeate this universe. There was no metaphysical field binding sentient beings together, no intuitive precognition shaping events. This absence was neither advantage nor disadvantage by itself, but it altered how causality unfolded. Without the Force, probability behaved more rigidly. Events were less prone to spontaneous convergence. This made long-term planning more viable, provided enough variables were controlled. Thrawn excelled at precisely this kind of environment. He began designing a contingency framework that treated the entire galaxy as a single battle space, not a unified polity, but an interconnected ecosystem. Trade routes became arteries. Political tensions became pressure points. Cultural myths became levers. His goal was not domination, but orchestration. If the Reapers arrived, the galaxy would need to respond as something it had never been before, adaptive at scale. That would require breaking old habits, forcing alliances that would otherwise remain theoretical, and introducing strategic shock before the enemy could. Thrawn understood that such manipulation bordered on moral transgression. Entire worlds might suffer destabilization in the short term. Economies could falter. Conflicts might flare. But extinction rendered morality moot. He did not justify his actions through ideology or righteousness. He justified them through arithmetic. Billions displaced today could prevent trillions annihilated tomorrow. Strategy did not concern itself with comfort, only outcomes. As preparations continued, Thrawn encountered the first genuine complication he had not fully anticipated: Shepard. Whether through coincidence or subtle design, the human specter began intersecting with multiple threads of Thrawn's influence network. Shepard's actions disrupted carefully balanced equations, not through chaos, but through persistence. Where most agents abandoned lines of inquiry under political pressure, Shepard pushed forward. Where others accepted official explanations, Shepard questioned them. Thrawn did not see Shepard as an enemy. He saw a catalyst. He adjusted his models accordingly. Individuals like Shepard could accelerate awareness, but also destabilize control. Heroes inspired unity, but they also drew attention. Thrawn had to decide whether to obscure Shepard's trajectory or subtly guide it. After careful consideration, he chose neither. Instead, he treated Shepard as an independent variable, something the Reapers would inevitably focus on. If the enemy fixated on the hero, they might overlook the architect operating in silence. By the time Thrawn completed his second phase analysis, he had reached another conclusion. This galaxy would not listen to warnings until it experienced loss. Controlled loss, strategically positioned, might awaken it without breaking it. The challenge would be ensuring that when the true enemy arrived, the galaxy's first instinct was not denial, but readiness. Thrawn did not smile at this realization. He simply refined his plans, aware that every step forward reduced the number of paths back. The board was set. The pieces were moving, unaware of the hand guiding them. And somewhere beyond the edges of known space, something ancient was already turning its attention inward, drawn by patterns it did not fully understand. The moment Thrawn accepted that controlled loss was inevitable, His strategy shifted from observation to orchestration. Until now, he had treated the Mass Effect galaxy as a system to be mapped and understood. Now, it became a system to be shaped. He began by identifying which forms of loss would be instructive rather than catastrophic. History had taught him that civilizations learned nothing from abstract warnings, but they learned too much from total devastation. The ideal outcome lay between those extremes, events severe enough to fracture complacency, yet contained enough to prevent irreversible collapse. He focused first on peripheral regions, areas politically significant enough to attract attention, but distant enough to avoid immediate galactic panic. Frontier colonies, disputed systems, and economically strategic relay junctions became focal points. These locations shared a common trait. They were defended adequately against conventional threats, but poorly prepared for asymmetric disruption. Thrawn exploited this not by attacking directly, but by manipulating conditions that encouraged failure from within. Supply chains were strained through misinformation. Defense fleets were redeployed based on falsified threat projections. Local leaders, convinced they were acting proactively, unknowingly weakened their own positions. When the first major incident occurred, it was officially classified as a tragic convergence of errors. A colony went dark after a cascading reactor failure triggered by a supposedly routine systems upgrade. Investigations found no evidence of sabotage, only a series of improbable oversights. Thrawn ensured that the truth remained buried beneath plausible incompetence. What mattered was not blame, but reaction. The Citadel Council expressed regret. Military advisors called for improved safety protocols. Economists reassured markets. No one asked whether the failure itself was a symptom rather than a cause. Thrawn observed this response with quiet concern. The lesson had not yet landed. The galaxy still believed that disasters were isolated events, solvable through incremental reform. To escalate awareness, he needed correlation. A single tragedy was dismissed. A pattern could not be. Over the following cycles, similar incidents unfolded across different species' territories. Not identical, but rhyming. Power failures, navigation errors, unexplained sensor blind spots. Each incident was independently rationalized, yet collectively they formed a constellation of anomalies that no single institution could explain. The tension began to seep into political discourse. Accusations surfaced, subtle at first, then sharper. Humans questioned Turian military overreach. Asari diplomats warned against reactionary militarization. Solarians proposed classified research initiatives that others were excluded from. Unity frayed under the weight of uncertainty. Thrawn allowed this friction to grow, carefully preventing it from igniting into open conflict. Division, he knew, was dangerous but also revealing. Under stress, true priorities emerged. At the same time, Thrawn turned his attention to myth-making. Every civilization constructed narratives to make sense of fear. He subtly fed those narratives, never inventing new myths, only reinforcing existing ones. Among the Turians, the language of duty and vigilance intensified. Among humans, frontier survivalism gained prominence. Among the Asari, ancient warnings buried in pre-Citadel lore resurfaced in academic circles. These stories did not align perfectly, but they did not need to. Their shared effect was psychological readiness. The galaxy was beginning to imagine an enemy it could not yet see. This was also when Thrawn took his greatest risk, limited contact. Not public, not overt, but selective. Through intermediaries and encrypted channels, fragments of analysis reached high-ranking military strategists across different species. The source was anonymous, the tone clinical. The content focused on predictive modeling, not prophecy. It demonstrated how current doctrines would fail against a non-linear, non-negotiable adversary. Some recipients dismissed it outright. Others archived it for later. A few took it seriously enough to begin quiet contingency planning. Those few were all Thrawn needed. The Reapers, though still dormant, were not passive. Thrawn detected subtle shifts in dark space activity, patterns of mass movement too precise to be natural. He inferred that the cycle was approaching its ignition phase. This accelerated his timeline. There would be no gradual awakening. The galaxy would be forced to adapt quickly or not at all. Thrawn revised his plans accordingly, increasing the tempo of disruption while tightening control over escalation vectors. One of his most significant interventions involved the relay network itself. He did not attempt to damage relays directly. Such an act would immediately expose an external hand. Instead, he manipulated traffic assumptions. By subtly altering predictive logistics models used by multiple governments, he caused fleets and trade convoys to converge on certain relays simultaneously. The resulting congestion strained navigation systems, leading to accidents and near catastrophes. The relay network, once seen as a symbol of stability, now appeared fragile. Dependence bred vulnerability. This realization struck particularly hard among military planners. If the relays could be compromised indirectly, then any centralized defense strategy was flawed. Decentralization became a topic of serious discussion. Redundant command structures were proposed. Mobile fleets independent of relay access were quietly commissioned. Thrawn observed these developments with measured satisfaction. Adaptation was occurring, albeit unevenly. Shepard's role continued to complicate matters. The Spectre's growing involvement with ancient technologies and persistent warnings about an inevitable machine threat aligned disturbingly well with Thrawn's own conclusions. Yet Shepard's approach was emotional, where Thrawn's was analytical. Shepard inspired belief through conviction, not structure. Thrawn recognized the danger of relying too heavily on a single symbol. Heroes could unite, but they could also be discredited, captured, or killed. A galaxy that placed its hope in one individual was strategically brittle. Rather than countering Shepard, Thrawn began designing his plans to function independently of the Spectre's success or failure. If Shepard triumphed, Thrawn's preparations would amplify the outcome. If Shepard failed, the infrastructure for resistance would still exist. This redundancy reflected Thrawn's core philosophy. Never hinge survival on a single variable, no matter how promising. As evidence of the Reaper's existence slowly surfaced, denial became harder to maintain. Ancient warnings were reinterpreted. Prothean ruins yielded clearer translations. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence gained coherence. Panic threatened to spread, but Thrawn intervened indirectly once more. Through controlled information leaks, he ensured that revelations emerged in stages, each accompanied by potential responses. Fear without options led to paralysis. Fear with structure led to action. Still, not all reactions were favorable. Some factions advocated preemptive aggression against suspected threats, despite lacking targets. Others proposed isolationism, withdrawing to fortified systems and abandoning the rest of the galaxy. Thrawn anticipated both impulses and worked to undermine them. Aggression without intelligence wasted. Resources. Isolation invited encirclement. He subtly promoted strategies emphasizing mobility, cooperation, and shared intelligence, framing them as pragmatic compromises rather than ideological choices. Behind all of this lay Thrawn's most controversial conclusion. The Reapers could not be defeated through force alone. Even if the galaxy united, raw firepower would only delay extinction. Victory required altering the conditions of the cycle itself. That meant understanding the Reaper's purpose, not merely their mechanics. Thrawn hypothesized that the cycle was not simply extermination, but control. A solution imposed to prevent some greater chaos. If that premise was correct, then the Reapers were not invincible gods, but custodians following an ancient mandate. This insight reshaped his endgame. Rather than planning for annihilation or total war, Thrawn began exploring scenarios of disruption and negotiation, not in the traditional diplomatic sense, but at the level of systemic logic. If the conditions that justified the cycle could be altered, the cycle itself might become obsolete. This was an audacious hypothesis, bordering on heresy in both galaxies. But Thrawn had built his career on challenging assumptions others accepted as immutable. As the first confirmed Reaper contact loomed on the horizon, Thrawn finalized his third phase framework. The galaxy was no longer asleep. It was uneasy, fragmented, but aware. Militaries were adjusting doctrines. Researchers were asking forbidden questions. Leaders were beginning to accept that survival might require abandoning cherished norms. The cost had been high, but extinction would have been higher. Thrawn did not view himself as savior or villain. Those labels were irrelevant. He was a strategist operating at a scale where morality blurred into necessity. Whether history would remember him as manipulator or protector depended entirely on outcomes yet to unfold. What mattered was that when the Reapers finally emerged from dark space, they would not find a galaxy repeating old mistakes. They would find something new, a civilization already wounded, already wary, already thinking beyond its own myths. And somewhere within that vast, trembling network of stars, an unseen hand would be ready to turn their ancient certainty into doubt. When the first Reaper revealed itself openly, it did not arrive as a sudden apocalypse. It arrived as confirmation. Long-range sensors detected a mass shadow emerging from dark space, moving with deliberate precision rather than chaotic force. To many leaders, this moment felt surreal, like watching a theoretical equation step off the page and begin to move. Panic surged, but it was a different kind of panic than Thrawn had feared. It was not disbelief. It was recognition. The galaxy had already been primed to understand what this meant, and that alone altered the opening phase of the conflict. Thrawn observed the initial reactions closely. Fleets mobilized faster than historical averages predicted. Evacuation protocols were activated with fewer delays. Civilian unrest, though present, was less catastrophic than expected. This did not mean the galaxy was prepared, only that it was no longer blind. That distinction mattered. In war, awareness was often the difference between annihilation and endurance. The Reaper made no attempt at communication. It did not need to. Its presence was declaration enough. Systems fell silent not because they were attacked, but because they shut themselves down under the weight of electromagnetic distortion. The machine's mere proximity disrupted technology built on assumptions of linear physics. Thrawn immediately adjusted his projections. This was not just a military threat. It was an environmental one. Any strategy that relied on technological superiority alone would collapse the moment Reapers entered operational range. Rather than ordering direct engagement, Thrawn influenced Allied command structures toward observational restraint. Fleets shadowed the Reaper at extreme distances, gathering data rather than firing. This restraint was controversial. Many commanders demanded immediate retaliation, citing morale and deterrence. Thrawn countered this instinct quietly, framing delay as respect for the unknown rather than fear. He understood something others did not yet grasp. The first battle was not about victory, but calibration. The Reaper eventually attacked a mid-tier industrial system, not a political capital or military stronghold. This choice reinforced Thrawn's long-standing assessment that the Reapers prioritized efficiency over symbolism. They struck where resistance would be minimal and psychological impact maximal. The system was harvested methodically. Fleets that attempted intervention were neutralized with terrifying precision, their weapons proving ineffective against layered kinetic barriers that adapted faster than targeting algorithms could compensate. The loss was devastating, but it was not meaningless. Data streamed back to observers, and Thrawn absorbed it all. Weapon inefficacy rates, barrier regeneration intervals, behavioral responses to threat vectors. Even in defeat, patterns emerged. The Reaper was not improvising. It was executing a doctrine. Thrawn disseminated this information selectively, ensuring it reached analysts capable of interpreting it rather than commanders driven by emotion. This created tension within the alliance. Some accused him of elitism, of hoarding knowledge. Thrawn accepted the criticism. Information shared too broadly became noise. Information shared precisely became leverage. As additional Reapers began to emerge, their movements confirmed his hypothesis. They did not advance as a unified armada. They spread out, each targeting different regions, forcing the galaxy to fragment its response. Centralized defense was rendered impossible. This was not conquest. It was cultivation. The Reapers were shaping the battlefield to prevent unified resistance from ever forming. Thrawn's counter-strategy evolved accordingly. Instead of attempting to unify all forces under a single command, he encouraged the formation of autonomous regional coalitions. Each coalition was structured differently, reflecting the strengths and cultural instincts of its member species. The Turians favored rigid military hierarchies and rapid response. Humans leaned toward adaptability and improvisation. Asari prioritized intelligence and long-term coordination. Rather than forcing these approaches into a single mold, Thrawn treated diversity as redundancy. If one doctrine failed, another might succeed. This approach frustrated politicians who craved visible unity. They wanted grand councils, shared banners, symbolic gestures of solidarity. Thrawn understood their value, but not at the cost of operational flexibility. Unity that collapsed under pressure was worse than fragmentation that endured. The Crucible project emerged during this phase, though not as a singular miracle weapon, but as a convergence of desperation and ancient knowledge. Thrawn was immediately skeptical of any solution framed as absolute. History taught him that such narratives often masked catastrophic trade-offs. Still, he did not dismiss the project. Instead, he reframed it. The Crucible was not a weapon to end the war. It was a variable to complicate it. By treating the Crucible as one element among many rather than the centerpiece of hope, Thrawn prevented strategic tunnel vision. Resources continued flowing into conventional research, electronic warfare, biological countermeasures, and psychological resilience programs. This distributed investment slowed progress in some areas, but ensured that failure in one would not doom all. As the war dragged on, the psychological toll deepened. Entire cultures faced extinction. Refugee populations strained host systems. Long-standing rivalries resurfaced under stress. Thrawn intervened not through speeches or mandates, but through structural incentives. Resource-sharing agreements were tied to intelligence cooperation. Defensive aid was contingent on population integration. Survival became conditional on collaboration. Some accused him of manipulation. They were correct. Thrawn did not deny it. Manipulation, he argued privately, was simply influence without illusion. The alternative was extinction without meaning. The Reapers adapted as expected. They began targeting infrastructure critical to coalition coordination. Data hubs vanished. Relay routes were severed. Communication lag increased. Thrawn responded by decentralizing further. Local commanders were given broader autonomy. Strategic objectives were simplified. Instead of defending everything, coalitions focused on preserving specific capabilities: shipyards, research facilities, cultural archives. Losses were inevitable. Preservation required prioritization. It was during this phase that Thrawn's most controversial decision emerged. He authorized controlled abandonment of several systems deemed strategically irrecoverable. Evacuations were executed under fire, leaving behind worlds to be harvested. The moral outrage was immense. Leaders accused him of playing God. Thrawn accepted the condemnation without defense. He understood something they did not want to face. Trying to save everything guaranteed, saving nothing. The abandoned systems were not wasted sacrifices. Each was prepared with hidden sensor arrays and delayed response probes. As the Reapers harvested them, data flowed back. Patterns sharpened. Weaknesses appeared, subtle but real. Energy expenditure thresholds. Predictable response sequences. Limits to adaptation speed when confronted with novel variables. These insights culminated in the first meaningful tactical success. A coalition fleet using unconventional formation dynamics and deliberately flawed attack vectors forced a Reaper into overcompensation. Its barriers failed asymmetrically. The kill was costly, nearly catastrophic, but it was achieved. For the first time, a Reaper fell not because of overwhelming force, but because it was tricked into miscalculating. The psychological impact was seismic. The Reapers were no longer invincible. They were still godlike, still overwhelmingly dangerous, but they could be killed. Hope surged, dangerous in its own way. Thrawn worked immediately to temper it. He ensured that reports emphasized the cost as much as the victory. Overconfidence, he knew, would undo everything. As the war entered its later stages, Thrawn's focus shifted once more, away from battles and toward outcomes. Even if the Reapers were defeated, the galaxy that emerged would be irrevocably changed. Power balances would shift. Entire species might vanish. The conditions that allowed the cycle to begin could reemerge if left unaddressed. Victory, without transformation, would only delay the next catastrophe. Thus, while others fought for survival, Thrawn planned for aftermath. He began outlining post-war governance frameworks, technological safeguards, and cultural exchange systems designed to prevent future systemic collapse. These plans were controversial, bordering on authoritarian in scope. But Thrawn did not intend to impose them unilaterally. He intended to make them unavoidable. By tying Reconstruction aid to structural reform, he ensured that survival would come with evolution. As the final phase approached, the galaxy stood battered but altered. It was no longer a collection of complacent civilizations drifting between relays. It was a scarred, adaptive network bound by shared trauma and hard-earned knowledge. Whether that would be enough to end the cycle remained uncertain. But for the first time in its long history, the galaxy was not merely reacting to extinction. It was planning beyond it. The later phase of the war unfolded not as a crescendo of constant battle, but as a tightening spiral. Space itself seemed to shrink as viable routes vanished, relays went dark, and once bustling regions became silent voids. What remained of the galaxy was compressed into fortified corridors of movement and defense. Thrawn recognized this pattern immediately. Compression favored entities that thrived on predictability and attrition. If allowed to continue unchecked, the Reapers would reduce the galaxy to a manageable shape and extinguish it piece by piece. To counter this, Thrawn introduced what many commanders initially dismissed as an act of strategic heresy. Instead of defending remaining corridors, he encouraged selective expansion into unstable, poorly charted regions of space. These areas were difficult to supply and dangerous to navigate, but they introduced uncertainty. The Reapers were forced to divert assets to track movements that did not conform to established patterns. This was not an attempt to reclaim territory. It was an effort to stretch the enemy's perception of the battlefield. This shift placed enormous strain on coalition logistics. Supply chains fractured. Fleets operated for extended periods without reinforcement. Morale suffered. Yet the alternative was stagnation, and stagnation favored the Reapers absolutely. Thrawn accepted the cost. He understood that survival was no longer about efficiency, but about denying the enemy certainty. As operations grew more decentralized, leadership itself began to transform. Traditional hierarchies gave way to competence-based authority. Commanders who demonstrated adaptability were elevated regardless of rank or origin. Those who clung to doctrine without adjustment found themselves sidelined. This evolution was not mandated from above. It emerged organically from necessity, guided subtly by Thrawn's influence, but never overtly enforced. Cultures resistant to change adapted or collapsed. There was no middle ground left. One of the most profound developments during this period was the emergence of hybrid tactical doctrines. Star Wars-era naval philosophy, long rooted in overwhelming force and clear chains of command, began to integrate Mass Effect-style combined arms maneuvering and electronic warfare. Fleets no longer moved as monolithic blocks. They fractured into interdependent task groups, each capable of independent action, but designed to reassemble fluidly. This fluidity confused Reaper predictive models, which relied on long-term behavioral consistency. The Reapers responded with escalation. They began deploying specialized units designed to disrupt coalition coordination rather than simply destroy assets. Indoctrination waves intensified, targeting not just individuals but entire command networks. Thrawn anticipated this and initiated one of his most morally ambiguous programs. Psychological compartmentalization protocols were introduced at the command level. Leaders were deliberately kept ignorant of certain information, reducing the risk of catastrophic compromise if indoctrinated. The ethical implications were severe. Trust eroded. Accusations of manipulation and dehumanization surfaced. Thrawn did not deny these outcomes. He viewed them as symptoms of a deeper truth. The war had already stripped away idealism. Pretending otherwise would only accelerate collapse. Survival required accepting that unity no longer meant shared knowledge, but shared purpose. It was during this phase that internal fractures threatened to undo everything. Several major factions openly questioned Thrawn's authority, arguing that his strategies prioritized long-term abstraction over immediate suffering. Some attempted to withdraw their forces entirely, focusing on preserving their own species at the expense of the wider coalition. Thrawn did not respond with coercion or threats. He responded with prediction. He presented these factions with detailed projections outlining the consequences of isolation, resource depletion timelines, refugee pressure points, probable Reaper countermeasures. He framed withdrawal not as betrayal, but as self-destruction. The effect was chilling, not because his words were persuasive, but because they were accurate. Most factions returned to cooperation not out of loyalty, but because reality offered no alternative. As the Crucible project advanced, it became increasingly clear that its activation would not be a simple endpoint. Conflicting interpretations of its function emerged. Some saw it as a weapon of annihilation. Others believed it would fundamentally alter the relationship between organic and synthetic life. Thrawn viewed it as neither salvation nor damnation. To him, the Crucible represented an inflection point. Whatever it did, it would permanently reshape the galaxy's trajectory. This understanding led Thrawn to prepare contingencies for every plausible outcome. Plans were drafted for scenarios in which advanced technology was lost entirely. Others assumed the persistence of synthetic intelligences under new constraints. Some envisioned a galaxy fractured by ideological schism in the aftermath. These preparations were not public. Revealing them would have sparked panic. Instead, they were embedded quietly into reconstruction frameworks, ensuring adaptability regardless of the outcome. As battles intensified near core regions, the Reapers began exhibiting behavior that concerned Thrawn deeply. They showed signs of prioritizing Thrawn himself. Fleets under his indirect influence were targeted disproportionately. Communication arrays associated with his strategic models were attacked with surgical precision. This suggested that the Reapers had identified him not merely as a threat, but as an anomaly within their cycle. This realization forced Thrawn into an uncomfortable self-assessment. He had always understood that his mind was his greatest weapon. Now it was also a liability. If the Reapers could model him accurately enough, they could neutralize his influence entirely. Thrawn responded by deliberately altering his own patterns. He introduced controlled randomness into his decision-making, delegating key choices to subordinates with divergent philosophies. The war effort became less efficient, but more unpredictable. This act of self-sabotage was perhaps Thrawn's most selfless decision. He relinquished a degree of control to preserve the system he had built. In doing so, he ensured that victory, if achieved, would not depend solely on him. The galaxy needed to survive without a singular mind guiding it. Otherwise, it would simply replace one form of dependency with another. The final confrontations approached not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Entire fleets were shadows of their former strength. Worlds lay in ruin. Species once proud now clung to survival with grim determination. And yet, something fundamental had changed. The galaxy no longer viewed itself as a collection of isolated civilizations. It had become an ecosystem, painfully aware that the extinction of one weakened all. When the moment came to commit fully to the Crucible's deployment, debate raged even as the decision became inevitable. Thrawn did not advocate for or against activation. Instead, he ensured that whatever choice was made would be executed with clarity and resolve. Indecision, he knew, would be fatal. As forces converged and the Reapers pressed harder than ever, Thrawn withdrew from direct, strategic influence. Not because his work was done, but because it needed to stand without him. The structures he had shaped now had to function autonomously. Whether they would succeed remained uncertain. But uncertainty, Thrawn believed, was preferable to inevitability. And for the first time since the Reapers had emerged from dark space, inevitability no longer belonged solely to them. The galaxy entered a strange, suspended moment as the final phase unfolded. It was not calm, but it was no longer purely chaotic either. Everything moved with the tense precision of a drawn breath that had not yet been released. Fleets repositioned, not for conquest or retreat, but for alignment. Every surviving power understood that whatever came next would define not just who lived, but what kind of galaxy would exist afterward. Thrawn observed this moment from a distance, both physically and strategically. He no longer issued constant directives. Instead, he monitored patterns, watching to see whether the adaptive structures he had helped build could function under ultimate pressure. The results were uneven, but promising. Some commanders rose beyond expectations, making decisions that balanced sacrifice with survival. Others faltered, reverting to instinct or fear. The difference was no longer cultural or ideological. It was psychological. Those who accepted uncertainty acted with clarity. Those who resisted it froze. The Reapers, sensing the convergence, altered their behavior again. Their movements became less methodical and more aggressive. Entire regions were scoured with overwhelming force rather than gradual assimilation. This shift confirmed Thrawn's long-held suspicion that the Reapers, while vast and ancient, were not immune to pressure. They were capable of urgency. And urgency, in a system built on inevitability, was a form of weakness. Coalition analysts noticed something else as well. The Reapers were no longer acting as a single, perfectly unified intelligence. Subtle divergences appeared in their responses to similar stimuli. Some units pursued annihilation relentlessly. Others shifted toward containment and delay. Whether this was a result of damage adaptation or the approaching influence of the Crucible remained unclear. What mattered was that the enemy was no longer perfectly singular. This fragmentation opened brief windows of opportunity. Not victories in the traditional sense, but survivable engagements. Fleets began to exploit hesitation, drawing Reaper forces into layered ambushes that emphasized disruption over destruction. The goal was not to win battles, but to preserve the capacity to fight the next one. Survival itself had become a strategic asset. One of the most significant developments during this phase was the emergence of decentralized intelligence synthesis. Instead of feeding all battlefield data into a central command, information was shared laterally across networks of commanders and analysts. This reduced reaction time and prevented catastrophic collapse if a single node was compromised. It also marked a philosophical shift. The galaxy was no longer trying to outthink the Reapers with a single mind. It was thinking around them. Thrawn recognized this as the natural evolution of resistance. He had not designed it directly, but he had created the conditions for it to emerge. In this sense, his influence became diffuse, embedded within the system rather than expressed through authority. If the galaxy survived, it would not remember him as a supreme commander, but as a catalyst. As the final approach to the Crucible neared, moral tension reached its peak. Entire populations were relocated or abandoned based on probability models. Some worlds were deliberately sacrificed to buy time. These decisions haunted the commanders who made them, but hesitation would have cost even more lives. The war had stripped away the illusion that survival could be clean or fair. The Crucible itself became a symbol of collective anxiety. To some, it represented hope so immense it bordered on faith. To others, it was an unknown too dangerous to trust. Thrawn viewed it as a mirror. Whatever choice the galaxy made, the Crucible would reflect its priorities back at it. Control, coexistence, destruction, transformation. Each outcome carried consequences that could not be undone. As preparations reached completion, Thrawn quietly initiated his final contingency. He ensured that the strategic frameworks guiding post-war reconstruction were distributed across multiple secure archives, encoded in ways that required cooperation between species to access. No single faction would be able to monopolize the future. If the galaxy survived, it would have to rebuild together, or not at all. When the moment finally arrived and the crucible was activated, the galaxy did not experience instant resolution. There was no immediate clarity, no universal understanding of what had occurred. Systems reacted differently. Some technologies failed. Others evolved. Synthetic intelligences experienced shifts that defied prediction. Organic life felt the impact not as revelation, but as disorientation. In the aftermath, silence fell across vast stretches of space. Not the silence of extinction, but the silence of recalibration. Survivors emerged slowly, uncertain of what rules still applied. Old power structures were gone or weakened. Long-held assumptions about dominance, progress, and destiny had been shattered. Thrawn did not step forward to shape the new order. He withdrew entirely from the center of events. His work was complete, not because the galaxy had achieved perfection, but because it had regained agency. It could now choose its path without the shadow of inevitable annihilation. History would debate his legacy. Some would call him ruthless. Others would credit him with saving civilizations that had once dismissed him as an outsider. But Thrawn himself would have found such judgments irrelevant. Survival was not about moral clarity. It was about adaptation. And in that regard, the galaxy had finally learned the lesson the Reapers themselves had forgotten. Change is not a flaw in a system. It is the only thing that allows it to endure. The first true realization after the Crucible's activation was that victory did not feel triumphant. It felt fragile. Across the galaxy, survivors struggled to understand what had changed and what had merely stopped. The Reapers were gone, or inert, or transformed beyond recognition, depending on the region and the technologies involved. But the scars they left behind were immediate and overwhelming. Star systems lay dark where infrastructure had collapsed. Relays functioned unpredictably or not at all. Entire trade networks that once defined galactic stability simply ceased to exist. In this uncertain vacuum, fear threatened to undo what unity had achieved during the war. Species that had fought side by side now faced one another with renewed suspicion. Old grievances resurfaced quickly when survival was no longer a shared emergency, but an individual concern. Thrawn had anticipated this phase long before the final confrontation. He understood that the true test of the galaxy was not defeating the Reapers, but resisting the instinct to fracture once the common enemy vanished. What prevented immediate collapse was not a new central authority, but exhaustion. No civilization had the strength left to dominate another. Fleets were damaged, populations displaced, economies shattered. Power, for once, was evenly distributed in its weakness. This forced dialogue where conquest might once have prevailed. Councils formed not because leaders trusted one another, but because isolation had become too dangerous. The ideological shift was subtle but profound. The galaxy had lived for millennia under the assumption that progress meant expansion, superiority, and control. The war exposed the fatal flaw in that logic. Expansion had made civilizations visible. Superiority had bred complacency. Control had invited resistance. Survival, it turned out, depended on restraint and cooperation more than dominance. Reconstruction efforts began unevenly. Core worlds stabilized faster, benefiting from redundant systems and surviving institutions. Frontier regions lagged behind, forced to innovate with limited resources. This imbalance threatened to recreate old hierarchies, but something unexpected occurred. Instead of hoarding advancement, several core systems shared technology and expertise openly. It was not altruism. It was strategy. A stable periphery reduced the likelihood of future existential threats going unnoticed. Thrawn's distributed archives slowly came online during this phase. They did not dictate policy or strategy. Instead, they provided frameworks for thinking. Models of conflict prevention, cultural analysis, and adaptive governance circulated quietly among scholars, military planners, and diplomats. His influence, though unseen, shaped decisions without commanding them. This was perhaps his most lasting contribution. He had taught the galaxy how to think beyond itself. Synthetic and organic relations also entered uncharted territory. Whatever the Crucible had done, it altered perceptions on both sides. Synthetics were no longer viewed solely as tools or threats. Organics were no longer seen as inherently irrational. The line between the two blurred, not biologically, but philosophically. Cooperation was no longer theoretical. It was necessary. Some feared this evolution, believing it diluted identity or invited future rebellion. Others embraced it as the logical next step in survival. Thrawn would have categorized both reactions as predictable. Change always frightened those who benefited most from the old order. But fear alone no longer carried the authority it once had. As years passed, the story of the war began to harden into myth. Details blurred. Heroes were simplified. Villains became symbols rather than entities. The Reapers were remembered as inevitability itself, a force of nature rather than an intelligence that had made choices and, ultimately, mistakes. Thrawn's role faded even faster. He did not fit comfortably into heroic narratives, nor into villainous ones. History prefers clarity. He embodied ambiguity, yet traces of his philosophy persisted. Military academies taught adaptive doctrine instead of rigid hierarchy. Diplomatic institutions prioritized cultural literacy alongside economic leverage. Even art and literature reflected a quieter shift, focusing less on conquest and more on endurance, memory, and transformation. The galaxy did not become peaceful. Conflict remained an intrinsic part of existence. But it changed in scale and intention. Wars were shorter, more contained, and more costly politically. Genocidal ambition became taboo not out of moral awakening, but because the galaxy had seen where inevitability thinking led. In the end, the greatest legacy of the war was not the defeat of the Reapers, but the collapse of the idea that any system, no matter how ancient or powerful, was beyond adaptation. The Reapers had believed themselves eternal. The galaxy had believed itself divided. Both assumptions proved false. And somewhere beyond the centers of power, beyond the rebuilt councils and new alliances, Thrawn remained what he had always been, an observer, a student of patterns, content in the knowledge that survival did not require perfection, only the willingness to learn before it was too late. The post-war galaxy slowly learned to breathe again, but breathing did not mean healing. Beneath the surface of reconstruction and diplomatic overtures, something more complex was unfolding, a redefinition of power itself. Before the Reaper War, power had been measured in fleets, territory, and technological dominance. Afterward, those metrics felt dangerously outdated. The civilizations that survived best were not the strongest, but the most adaptable. This realization reshaped politics more deeply than any treaty. Several regional coalitions began forming organically, not around species lines, but around shared strategic realities. Systems connected by fragile relay routes coordinated defense and logistics together. Mixed species fleets became the norm rather than the exception, not out of idealism, but efficiency. Command structures flattened. Rigid chains of authority had failed catastrophically during the war, unable to respond to asymmetric threats. Flexibility became doctrine. Thrawn's influence surfaced most clearly here. His writings emphasized that centralized control created single points of failure, while decentralized competence created resilience. Without ever invoking his name, planners adopted this principle. Admirals were granted greater autonomy. Intelligence cells operated semi-independently, cross-referencing data laterally instead of funneling everything upward. Mistakes still happened, but they were smaller, contained, and corrected faster. Culturally, the galaxy experienced a quiet reckoning. Species that once defined themselves by ancient pride now confronted uncomfortable truths about their past decisions. The Asari faced scrutiny over their secrecy. The Solarians were questioned about their manipulative pragmatism. The Turians reassessed the rigidity that had once been their greatest strength. Even humanity, still relatively young on the galactic stage, grappled with the speed at which it had gained influence and the responsibilities that came with it. This period produced friction, but also honesty. Truth commissions emerged on several worlds, examining wartime decisions without the usual political shielding. Not every revelation led to reconciliation. Some reopened wounds that had barely scarred. But suppression was no longer viable. The war had proven that lies scaled upward into extinction-level consequences. Technology advanced cautiously. The temptation to reverse-engineer Reaper remnants was immense, but fear tempered ambition. Research protocols became multilayered, requiring cross-species oversight. No single government was allowed unilateral control over existential technologies. Progress slowed, but catastrophes were avoided. For the first time in galactic history, restraint became a strategic asset. Synthetic civilizations, whether newly independent or long established, played an increasingly visible role. Their perspectives reshaped ethical debates around autonomy, memory, and continuity. Where organics saw survival as generational, synthetics perceived it as cumulative. This difference enriched planning rather than dividing it. Long-term modeling benefited enormously from synthetic input, while organics provided context rooted in culture and emotion. The partnership was not perfect, but it was functional, and that was enough. On the frontier, however, old dangers resurfaced in new forms. Pirate confederations grew bold, exploiting weakened patrol routes. Warlords emerged on isolated worlds, claiming protection in exchange for loyalty. These threats were localized, but persistent. The galaxy responded not with massive campaigns, but targeted interventions. Intelligence-first operations dismantled leadership structures rather than annihilating populations. It was slower, more surgical, and far less destructive. This approach frustrated those who longed for decisive displays of force. But decisive force had nearly ended everything. The memory remained too fresh to ignore. As decades passed, children grew up hearing about the Reaper War as history rather than lived trauma. With distance came curiosity. Scholars debated alternate outcomes. Artists reimagined events through allegory. Philosophers questioned whether the galaxy had truly learned anything or merely been scared into temporary cooperation. Thrawn's name appeared occasionally in obscure academic circles, referenced as an external variable that altered probability rather than destiny. And yet, the most important change was invisible. The galaxy no longer believed in inevitability, not in cycles of extinction, not in unbreakable hierarchies, not in eternal enemies. Every system was now understood as conditional, dependent on choices made and revised. This belief did not guarantee safety. It guaranteed vigilance. The stars remained dangerous. Unknown regions still held mysteries beyond mapping. New threats would come, because complexity always breeds them. But when they did, they would face a galaxy that had learned painfully and imperfectly that survival was not about dominating the future, but staying awake to it. And that more than any fleet or weapon was the true victory. With vigilance established as the galaxy's new baseline, attention slowly shifted from survival to meaning. Civilizations that had spent generations reacting to crises now faced a subtler challenge. What does a galaxy do when it is no longer defined by imminent extinction? This question proved more destabilizing than war itself. Purpose, once dictated by necessity, now had to be chosen. Different cultures answered in radically different ways. Some worlds leaned into expansion, not as conquest, but as exploration. Long-abandoned relay paths were cautiously reopened. Deep space observatories were constructed at the edges of mapped territory, staffed by multi-species crews trained not just in science, but in diplomacy and first contact protocol. The unknown was no longer treated purely as a threat, but as a responsibility. Every discovery carried the implicit question of whether the galaxy was prepared to encounter something truly alien again. Others turned inward. Entire civilizations embarked on cultural renaissances, reviving suppressed art forms, philosophies, and spiritual traditions that had been deemed inefficient or obsolete before the war. The logic was simple. A galaxy that forgot how to value beauty and reflection would eventually forget why it wanted to survive at all. These movements did not reject technology or progress, but they insisted that advancement without identity led only to hollow endurance. Politically, this era saw the slow decline of dominance-based leadership. Figures who rose by projecting strength alone found themselves outpaced by those who could synthesize complexity. Leaders were no longer expected to have all the answers. They were expected to ask better questions, to assemble minds smarter than their own, and to know when not to act. This shift frustrated traditional power blocks, but it produced stability that brute authority never had. Thrawn's shadow lingered here in an unexpected way. His greatest contribution was no longer tactical doctrine, but epistemology, the idea that understanding an opponent's culture was not a courtesy, but a prerequisite for survival. This principle expanded beyond warfare into diplomacy, trade, and even internal governance. Policies were increasingly stress-tested against cultural impact models. A law that destabilized a minority population was no longer considered efficient, no matter how economically sound it appeared on paper. Education transformed accordingly. Military academies taught art history alongside strategy. Diplomatic schools required coursework in behavioral psychology and myth analysis. The assumption was no longer that enemies would think like you, but that they never would. Misinterpretation became recognized as one of the galaxy's most dangerous forces. Despite these advances, fault lines remained. Some species resented the dilution of traditional hierarchies. Others feared that cultural sensitivity would become paralysis, that hesitation would invite exploitation. Fringe movements emerged advocating a return to clear dominant structures, arguing that the galaxy was confusing caution with weakness. These ideologies gained traction in regions that had suffered disproportionately during the war and felt abandoned during Reconstruction. The response to these movements was telling. Instead of suppression, they were confronted with transparency. Debates were public. Historical data was laid bare. Simulations demonstrated outcomes of proposed policies not as propaganda, but as probabilistic forecasts. Some extremists doubled down. Others disengaged. But the galaxy resisted the urge to simplify itself into binaries again. On the military front, doctrine continued evolving toward anticipation rather than reaction. Predictive modeling systems, informed by synthetic and organic inputs alike, focused on pattern emergence rather than threat identification. The goal was not to wait for an enemy to appear, but to recognize the conditions under which one would inevitably form. Intervention at this stage was often subtle: economic support, cultural exchange, or mediated governance reform. War became the last option rather than the first response. This approach did not eliminate conflict, but it changed its texture. Violence became episodic instead of systemic. Crises flared and burned out rather than cascading. The galaxy still lost lives, still mourned, still failed at times. But collapse was no longer the default endpoint. Perhaps the most profound shift occurred in how history itself was recorded. Instead of linear chronicles of heroes and villains, archivists adopted relational histories, mapping how decisions intersected across species and eras. No event was isolated. Every outcome was contextual. Blame gave way to causality. This did not absolve wrongdoing, but it grounded accountability in understanding rather than outrage. Children born in this era inherited a galaxy quieter than their ancestors, but heavier with memory. They grew up learning not just what happened, but why it happened, and how easily it could happen again. The lesson was not fear, but responsibility. And so the galaxy moved forward, not toward utopia, but toward coherence. It did not claim to be wiser than before, only more aware of its own fragility. In that awareness lay a strength no empire, no machine intelligence, and no singular genius could ever impose. The future, once a battleground of inevitability, became something far rarer. A shared choice. Choice, once reclaimed, reshaped the galaxy in ways no single architect could have predicted. When survival ceased to be the overriding directive, societies began experimenting again, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The galaxy did not rush forward. It tested each step, aware now that momentum, without reflection, had nearly destroyed everything before. Progress became deliberate, uneven, and deeply personal to each civilization. One of the earliest changes emerged in how alliances were formed. The old model of permanent blocks gave way to adaptive coalitions, flexible arrangements built around shared objectives rather than ideological loyalty. A species might align militarily with one group while collaborating culturally or scientifically with another. This overlapping web of relationships made betrayal harder and misunderstanding rarer. No one stood entirely alone, but no one was trapped in rigid loyalty either. Trade followed the same philosophy. Instead of resource extraction at scale, economies emphasized resilience. Worlds specialized not in domination of markets, but in redundancy of supply. Scarcity was treated as a warning sign rather than a business opportunity. This frustrated profiteers accustomed to exploiting imbalance, but it stabilized regions that had previously collapsed under economic pressure before any enemy ever arrived. Technology, too, took a quieter path. Instead of racing toward ever greater destructive capacity, research focused on integration. Artificial intelligence systems were no longer isolated tools or sovereign entities. They were designed to coexist, embedded within ethical frameworks shaped by multi-species consensus. Every major system was required to include interpretability layers, ensuring that decisions could be questioned, audited, and understood. Mystery was no longer equated with superiority. Culturally, a new narrative archetype emerged. Stories stopped glorifying lone saviors who carried the galaxy on their shoulders. Instead, they centered on collectives, on imperfect groups navigating uncertainty together. Audiences responded strongly to this shift. Perhaps they recognized themselves in it. Perhaps they were tired of myths that implied catastrophe could only be solved by exceptional individuals rather than shared responsibility. This shift had a subtle but profound psychological effect. Citizens no longer waited for heroes. They expected institutions to work, neighbors to contribute, and leaders to listen. When failures occurred, outrage was tempered by participation. Protests were not demands for replacement, but for repair. Accountability became collaborative rather than punitive. Yet tension never fully disappeared. It simply changed form. Instead of existential wars, the galaxy grappled with philosophical divides. How much autonomy should synthetic beings possess? Where did cultural preservation end and stagnation begin? How much risk was acceptable in exploration after everything that had been lost? These debates could be fierce, but they were fought with argument rather than annihilation. Thrawn's influence surfaced again in this era, not as doctrine, but as a cautionary reference. Analysts studied how one mind had altered an entire galaxy's trajectory without ever ruling it. The conclusion was not to seek another Thrawn, but to ensure that no single perspective could ever dominate unchecked again. Systems were designed to absorb brilliance without surrendering sovereignty to it. Education reinforced this lesson. Students were taught not just to excel, but to contextualize excellence. A brilliant tactician without empathy was considered incomplete. A visionary leader without humility was considered dangerous. Failure was analyzed without shame, success without worship. At the edges of known space, explorers encountered remnants of civilizations long erased, victims of cycles older than recorded history. These ruins were no longer seen as warnings of inevitable doom, but as mirrors. Each collapse told a story of imbalance, knowledge without restraint, unity without diversity, control without understanding. The galaxy listened. Gradually, an unspoken agreement formed across species. Survival was no longer the highest value. Continuity was. Not just existing, but continuing to choose wisely, to remember, to adapt without erasing what made each culture distinct. The galaxy did not become peaceful in the absolute sense. Conflict remained an expression of difference. But difference was no longer treated as a prelude to destruction. It became the raw material of coexistence. And in that slow, careful unfolding of futures no longer dictated by fear, the galaxy achieved something it had never truly known before. Not victory, balance. The arrival of Grand Admiral Thrawn in the Mass Effect universe did not end with conquest, collapse, or coronation. It ended with transformation. Not the loud, triumphant kind written into legends, but the quieter, more unsettling kind that forces civilizations to look inward and question the foundations they have always assumed were permanent. Thrawn did not rule this galaxy, yet few figures ever reshaped it so completely. What made Thrawn's impact enduring was not his fleet strength or tactical brilliance alone, but his refusal to treat chaos as inevitable. Where the Mass Effect galaxy had grown accustomed to reacting, responding to Reaper cycles, political deadlock, and existential threats, Thrawn introduced a different mindset. He treated every crisis as a symptom of deeper structural failure. Every war was evidence of misalignment. Every collapse was predictable, not tragic. That perspective changed how leaders, soldiers, and civilians understood conflict itself. In the aftermath of his departure, no empire rose bearing his name. No doctrine carried his seal. Yet his fingerprints were everywhere. In councils that demanded dissent before consensus. In military academies that taught cultural literacy alongside strategy. In governments that redesigned themselves not to maximize power, but to survive scrutiny. Thrawn's greatest victory was convincing the galaxy that brilliance without restraint was as dangerous as ignorance, and that order imposed without understanding would always collapse under its own weight. The Mass Effect universe emerged altered, not unified, but aware. Aware that cycles were not fate, that extinction was not destiny, that intelligence, organic or synthetic, did not need to dominate to endure. This awareness did not eliminate fear, but it stripped fear of its authority. Decisions were no longer made in panic or prophecy, but in responsibility. The Reapers, once gods of inevitability, were reduced to a cautionary memory, not because they were defeated by superior firepower alone, but because the galaxy learned to deny them their greatest weapon, predictability. A galaxy capable of self-examination, adaptation, and shared accountability could not be harvested on schedule. It could not be neatly categorized. It could not be controlled by a single narrative of survival. Thrawn himself became something paradoxical in galactic history. A villain to some, a necessary disruption to others. To most, a reminder that the most dangerous individuals are not those who seek power openly, but those who understand systems well enough to make power obsolete. His legacy forced a permanent discomfort into the galaxy's conscience, a refusal to ever again accept stagnation disguised as stability. In the end, the Mass Effect universe did not become safer. It became wiser. And that difference mattered more than any fleet, any throne, or any final battle ever could. Because survival, once chosen consciously instead of reflexively, ceased to be the galaxy's greatest fear, and became its shared responsibility.